What if I told you that taxi drivers might have stumbled upon some unexpected shield against one of medicine's most devastating diseases? Well, there's a fascinating new study out by the Harvard Medical School just today. Researchers have discovered that taxi and ambulance drivers have the lowest rates of Alzheimer's disease mortality among all occupations that they've studied. But before you run out, quit your job, become a cab driver, let's dive in and see what this research really tells us and maybe what it doesn't tell us. Yeah, today I'm just doing a straight up cool science story. I stumbled upon this brand new publication, and what intrigued me about it was not just the connection between navigation ability or navigation skills and brain health, but I also wanted to use this study as kind of a window into what's the complex world of medical statistics. Like, how do researchers tease apart correlation from causation? And there's a lot. I'm going to show you a really strong correlation that this paper comes up with, and we'll talk about that connection then with causation. And what hidden factors might explain what are probably to you fairly surprising findings. And really, maybe you want to know, what can this tell us about our daily activities that might, influence our brain health? I think we'd all be interested in improving our brain health. So when I saw this paper, I thought it'd be a really nice opportunity to show like the details of how a scientific study actually happens, and then really get into the nuances of how we should interpret data. So when you hear what inevitably will be the over-the-top clickbait news, bits that you hear about, probably maybe about this particular paper on your social media in the next few days, you'll kind of like know the ground truth, right? The facts behind the popular press and the popular news. So let's explore this paper. And again, I'm pretty much just gonna read through the paper with you, and I want to talk about publishing. I'm gonna say that most of my audience is going to be some who aren't familiar with like scientific publishing. And so I want to talk a little bit through the elements of a paper, the process of doing this type of analyses, and how to interpret the results, how to interpret the discussion section, and their findings. Right? Just what do you look for? What do I look for when I pick up a paper like this? How do I scan through it and try to get as much as I can out of it to understand what the researchers did and what the significance of their results are? And most importantly, really, sometimes is what are the limitations of the paper? What else do we need to know to maybe come to stronger conclusions? What does this point us to in terms of further research? All right, let's get to it. Alzheimer's disease mortality among taxi and ambulance drivers, a population-based cross-sectional study. All right, so you probably don't know what a population-based cross-sectional study is, but if you stick with me, you'll know a little bit more about what that is. We've got 4 authors here. And amongst those 4 authors, you'll see that like the first one comes from Harvard Medical School. We've got Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. We have Massachusetts General Hospital, and we have collaboration with the National Bureau of Economic Research. And the corresponding author, so you see each one of these authors have these relationships with different institutions. This is required by most journals to identify, like, where you work and what your responsibilities were for the paper. And you'll see this last author is what's called the corresponding author. Corresponding author would be the one like, you have questions about this? If I had questions about this study, I could write this person. You could write this person yourself. Anyone out there, this is public information. This particular study actually didn't directly use taxpayer dollars, but any study that uses taxpayer dollars has to be publicly available. And those who, did the research, with your taxpayer dollars need to be available to some extent to answer the public's questions. So here we have correspondence to A.B. Jenna, and there's the email address right there at Harvard Medical School. And this is kind of a new thing. Well, newish in the last few years, scientific journals actually publishing, in this case, here we have their X account, right? So that's another way that you would have access to this person. You could message this person if you had a question about this paper. What else do we have here? This paper was accepted on the 27th of October, 2024. So it was submitted at some time before that. Some journals show the information like when it was submitted. So that way you get an idea of like how long it was in review, the peer review process. Here was accepted on the 27th of October, not too long ago, and it's taken the last month and a half probably to format it and get it ready to actually publish and show to the public. And it was published on, over here we see the 17th of December 2024. Okay, so that's the the who of who's doing this work. So this particular journal, didn't say what the journal was. This is BMJ, that's the British Medical Journal. And their particular format of recent years is to have very clear, explicit, setting out, like, here's what we found. Here's our basic design. Here's our conclusions. You can get it all here on the first page. So let's look at that. So we can get like the big picture. And then we'll kind of go into some more details because I think it's really important to see some of the caveats in the paper. So what was their objective? Well, they wanted to analyze mortality attributed to Alzheimer's disease, specifically among taxi drivers and ambulance drivers. Now, they actually looked at a massive data set, and out of that data set popped a bunch of interesting information, of which taxi drivers and ambulance drivers were included. But as we'll see in the introduction, there was prior research on taxi drivers that suggested there's something interesting about taxi drivers' brains, right? And so they suspected that taxi driver brains might result in a reduced chance of developing Alzheimer's. And they wanted to know, is that really true? All right, if we look at a really large data set that has enough taxi drivers in it, would be able to show that taxi drivers have fewer incidences of Alzheimer's. And their rationale is that those occupations demand frequent spatial and navigation processes compared to other occupations, and it'll become clear why that's important in a moment in terms of the portion of the brain that they're interested in. What's their design? Well, it's a population-based cross-sectional study, so they're looking at large populations. They're looking across a whole bunch of different variables, different ages, and they're looking at different occupations, and Alzheimer's is their interest, but they're also going to compare this to other types of mortality as well. All right, we need to parse out some of these things. How did they do this? Well, they used death certificates from the National Vital Statistics System in the United States. That comes from the CDC. That's a subdivision of the CDC by the U.S. government. Their data collection, information comes to hospitals, death certificates all get processed through there. And from that, there's a large national database upon which you can draw. You can go to the CDC, again, taxpayer dollars, and there are lots of reports you can download there, and you can look at enormous amounts of data. That's what these folks have done here. That's what these researchers have done. They've just downloaded this massive amount of information, and they had a particular question they want to analyze that data for. Now, they used death certificates from, linked to occupation, which apparently is a recent thing, that occupation is something that's on the forms in which if you go to the hospital or on a death certificate, questions are asked about what did that person do for the majority of their career? What were they involved with? And you might wonder, why do they ask these types of questions? Why do we need to collect that kind of data? You may have something and you're like, oh boy, why do I have to get asked these 50 different questions? Part of that is for them to know about you, and there's things that you might not understand that they need to know, but it also goes into these larger data sets, which allow us to do these types of studies, which are really only possible. We can only make these types of connections if we have lots of data points. There aren't that many taxi drivers in the world, and so to collect enough information of taxi drivers to be able to compare them to other occupations to get to a statistically relevant sample size, you're going to need hundreds of thousands. And in this case, what are the participants? I think it says down here, Oh, yes, the participants, 8,972,221 and 221 people. So you have records for that number of people, all of which died between the years of, let's go back up here, January 1st, 2020 to December of 2022. So a 3-year span, 20, 21, 22. Over a 3-year period, United States, that's 8.9 million people have died during that time that had occupational information. So first, they have all the data, and then some of the data is missing for occupational information. And then you have to pare it down a little bit more because some people might have had multiple different occupations. If they were a taxi driver for a week, that's not going to be very useful if we're thinking about, does being a taxi driver make a difference to the brain, right? Being a taxi driver for a week, I doubt is going to have an influence. Boy, you'd have to have a enormous data set in order to find that kind of correlation. But anyway, cutting out, you have to take out individuals that, had either don't have occupational information or were not taxi drivers for long enough to really say that that is truly their occupation over a long period of time. So 3 years. What are their participants? This is a little, kind of sad to think that the participants are deceased adults, 18 years and older. And then we're going to talk about the distribution of those individuals, and that comes into play in terms of the analysis as well. Main outcome measures. What are the things they're measuring? Among 443 occupations studied, so 443 main types of occupations. So somebody has come up with a classification of occupations by which that they're selecting from in order to identify occupations. And that is then a national list, right, that has to be consistently applied across multiple different states and institutions. That's the only way this data really works. You have to be able to compare apples to apples. That's the reason we have those kind of standards. That's why some organizations like the CDC or the National Institutes of Health or something like that comes up with the criteria for the way we name things and criteria for medical records. So what do they do? They have 443 occupations. They studied the percentage of deaths attributed to Alzheimer's disease for taxi drivers and ambulance drivers and each of the remaining 441 occupations. So they actually looked at every single one of those 443 occupations and determined the percentage of individuals who died, who were identified as having died from Alzheimer's or being Alzheimer's related. All right. Then they have to adjust for death and other socio-demographic factors. So that's another thing that's on records, is to figure out their socioeconomic status and things like that in order to look at other variables that might be involved. Great. What are the results? That's what we're here for. We're here for the results. As I said before, 8.9 million people were in this data set. And of those, 3.88%, or 348,000 over 3 years, had Alzheimer's disease listed as a cause of death. I don't know, found that number pretty striking. All right, myself, 3.88% overall. Now, this is everyone who has died from the year 18 on up. I mean, not many people are going to have died from Alzheimer's at 18, right? Or 20 or 25 or 35 or 45 or 55, right? It's really something that's after 55, really after 60. And therefore, you imagine that the percentage across different age ranges is going to be very different, right, than 3.88. This is the average across all age ranges. Now, most of those 8.9 million deaths would be individuals that are more than 50 years old. So that represents most of the data. Among taxi drivers, so let's just look at, if you just look at all the deaths, 3.88%, and then you look at taxi drivers, 1.03% died from Alzheimer's disease. So that's 171 out of a whole 16,658 individuals that identified being a taxi driver as their primary occupation. While among ambulance drivers, the rate was only 0.74, or 10 out of 13,048. I'm sorry, 10 out of 1,348. All right, so significantly lower than the 3.88 overall. But you should be saying to yourself, Okay. Those are again averages. That's interesting. That's an interesting relationship, but how meaningful is that? I mean, maybe, you can make an argument like maybe taxi drivers, their average age is only like 50 and most of them die by the time they're 60 because of some other causes. But they get in accidents or there's some other occupational hazard, something about being a taxi driver that results in their lifespan being shortened. In which case they don't reach the age of developing Alzheimer's, in which case they wouldn't have died of Alzheimer's. But that doesn't mean they potentially couldn't have gotten Alzheimer's if they had lived longer. Right? So that's where you get into these adjustments. That's where you have to say to yourself, all right, how can I do an apples to apples comparison? Okay. So we're going to need to take individuals in an age range. We're going to say, okay, taxi drivers that lived, that died from age 50 or 55 up to 85, and compare that to the populations of other occupations in that same age range, which would be the age range where Alzheimer's actually presents itself. That would be a fair comparison between the two. All right, so that's where this comes in. After adjustment, ambulance drivers, 0.91%, and taxi drivers, 0.03 or 1.03, had the lowest proportion of deaths due to Alzheimer's. You can see those numbers really weren't that much different. That's because, again, most of those 8.9 million deaths were among individuals that are more than 40 years old. And then when they adjust for things like, let's compare taxi drivers at certain ages, turns out they don't really die necessarily any earlier than the average person, right? Their average lifespan is quite similar. So again, my hypothesis was shown to be incorrect. If that was my hypothesis, that maybe they all die early and that's why it looks like they don't die of Alzheimer's or wouldn't get Alzheimer's. This trend was not observed in other trend. Okay, so I want to make sure you noted this. Ambulance drivers, taxi drivers. Now, what really also caught my eye in this paper is they didn't just stop there. They compared to other kind of similar occupations, at least in the travel industry. This trend was not observed in other transportation-related jobs that are less reliant on real-time spatial and navigational processing for other types of dementia. Results were consistent with Alzheimer's disease. Oh, let me stop there. So they looked at we'll get to it. If you're an airline pilot or you're a bus driver, you're as likely, in one case, more likely to have developed Alzheimer's than the average person, as opposed to taxi drivers and ambulance drivers, which are significantly less likely to develop Alzheimer's. So that's what we have to address is this a real phenomena? And how would we explain this difference? So results were consistent whether Alzheimer's disease was recorded as an underlying or contributing cause of death. Alzheimer's might not be the direct cause of death, but if there's Alzheimer's present and it contributed to it, that's another classification. So what's their conclusions? Shouldn't give away the story, right up front, but we need to, because then we'll find out why do they come to those conclusions. Taxi drivers and ambulance drivers, occupations involving frequent navigational and spatial processing, had the lowest portions of death attributed to Alzheimer's disease of all occupations. Well, there had to be an occupation that had the lowest, right? I mean, you have 443 occupations. You're going to measure a bunch of data. There must be one that has the highest, frequency, and there must be one with the lowest. So the question here would be, what causes them to be the lowest? All right. What causes them to be the lowest? All right. Let's dig into the paper a little bit deeper now. So not going to read this entire paper to you. Let's go through, we'll hit a couple highlights to give you kind of some more background information so that we can talk about some of the other variables that might be involved here. You start out an introduction in any paper like this, like, why is this important? Right? Hey, I'm trying to publish this. Why should you care? That's where you're going to start. Deaths attributed to Alzheimer's disease have doubled over the past 3 decades, will likely increase as the population ages. That's a really common first line of an Alzheimer's related paper. Despite decades of research, an important gap remains in the development of definitive treatment or prevention strategies. Yes. What treatments do you know of? I mean, are there any drugs? There are drugs that are in the pathway of development in various stages. Some have been failures already. There's a couple with a little bit of hope that they might help at least ameliorate or postpone the effects of Alzheimer's. And in terms of prevention strategies, since we don't really know what causes it, it's hard to know what are you not supposed to eat, what are you not supposed to get what are you not supposed to contact in the environment. We know that there is some genetics involved. There's a higher frequency of certain genetic loci, alleles in people that predispose them to being more likely to develop Alzheimer's. But it's not like you have this gene, you will get Alzheimer's. It just increases your chance of having Alzheimer's. But since it's not wholly genetic, it's not just inherited. There must be an environmental factor as well. And where do taxi drivers come in? Like how would they have lower? So one of the possibilities would be nature nurture, right? It's let's say taxi drivers, either maybe they're just genetically different than everybody else. Maybe there's something in their genes that like leads them to be like want to be a taxi driver. And that's why most taxi drivers have this special gene or special set of different alleles, different variants, and those help them prevent getting Alzheimer's, right? So you can say maybe it's a genetic thing. But if it's a genetic thing and taxi drivers aren't related to each other, you have to say somehow their genes lead them to, the taxi driver business. Then it could be environment. Maybe there's something about sitting around a taxi and munching on certain foods, or the air quality, or something about the environment, or the great conversations they have, right? I don't know. So what stimulation are they experiencing from outside that might be affecting the development of their brain over time? Yeah, after he says, well, we don't know what the prevention strategies are. Well, there is this really interesting landmark study, and I remember these studies from, actually they're quite old. Some go back to the early 2000s. Quite old. That's old in this type of research world. A landmark neuroimaging study showed that taxi drivers in London developed enhanced functional changes in the hippocampus. That's a little portion of the brain back here. And the hippocampus is the brain region involved in both the creation of cognitive spatial maps and the development of Alzheimer's disease, which is associated with accelerated hippocampal atrophy. Atrophy would be like decay, right? You're losing a portion of that part of your brain. That's one of the first places that shows up in brain scans for Alzheimer's patients, and that's one of the diagnostics for Alzheimer's versus other forms of dementia. And so this is you're saying is interesting. Taxi drivers have enhanced functional changes. They actually have a little bit larger sized hippocampi, and compared to the average person. Now that might suggest that, well, as I said before, maybe it's genetic. Now in those papers you see is like, it's not necessarily that they were born with larger hippocampi, but it's more that maybe their job requiring lots of spatial orientation, like thinking through maps, constant awareness, constant you have to have a visual field that allows you to see all the different things happening. You're looking for customers. You're trying not to get into an accident in the middle of a city, right? It's a very chaotic, but also three-dimensional world that you're constantly enveloped in. And the fact that you're constantly using that portion of your brain, it's like a muscle, right? You're working out the hippocampus in a way that most of us aren't doing. And if you're a taxi driver over many, many years, potentially that is reshaping that portion of your brain, and you become literally better at that kind of analysis. Maybe you started with a little bit of an advantage in that area. And that's one of the reasons it was easy for you to be a taxi driver. Hey, I just know where I'm going, and I understand the direction I'm looking, and I got a visual map of the city in my head, even without really practicing much. And other people you hear say like, I don't get, I can't follow a map. I forget. I'm not aware of where I'm at. I don't know which direction I'm going, no matter how much I try. So, we all have a sense that there are some people that are very good with spatial orientation, geometry things, and others are like terrible at spatial orientation. And that fact alone tells us there is some genetic differences between us. So what does all that suggest? That suggests the possibility that occupations that demand frequent spatial processing, such as taxi driving, might be associated with decreased Alzheimer's disease mortality. The simple idea here is that if you've developed the hippocampus and you're constantly engaging the hippocampus, that is somehow driving away the effects of this atrophy or whatever tendency would be to start the process of developing Alzheimer's, which is a long time development of certain kinds of buildup of certain proteins around in neurons. Maybe that inhibits that process, and therefore their vocation is helping them prevent them from getting Alzheimer's. Now, this is where we're going to go to correlation and causation. See, where we're saying there's a correlation. I haven't looked at the figures yet, but there's a pretty darn strong correlation, and you can show it's statistically significant. This is not by chance, right? These are, there's too many individuals, too many taxi drivers that have a low enough frequency of Alzheimer's compared to the average population that just isn't an accident. It's not a statistical aberration. It's a real phenomena. Now we need to explain the phenomena. And one possible explanation for it is there is a causal link, right, to the hippocampus and the person's activity, right, their vocation, that is then preventing them from getting Alzheimer's. Now, that's not proven in this paper. This is just like, hey, that is a hypothesis now. And at the end of the paper, just give away the last little part there. It's like, these results aren't definitive in terms of our suggestion that it's the hippocampus and it's working out that portion of your brain, which helps you prevent Alzheimer's. It's a preventative medicine, basically. That is a hypothesis, right? Which is supported by this data, but not tested for directly. Right? There's a lot of other things you have to do to test for that more direct connection. But this is a great start. I mean, this is a way you start research projects and find new things, new ways, and new discoveries. And it's by looking at large data sets like this, finding correlations. Those correlations then lead you to a number of different potential hypotheses, which you then can devise tests for, and then eliminate those hypotheses or find more supporting evidence for that hypothesis, which then may lead you to even more greater insights into the cause of Alzheimer's and possible preventative strategies. So to investigate this possibility, we leveraged population-based U.S. mortality data, which includes the newly linked information on occupation of people that have died. So that's data that didn't used to exist. So that's why they're going back to 2020. To evaluate Alzheimer's disease mortality across various professions, we hypothesized that occupations such as taxi driving and ambulance driving, but not emergency medical technicians or EMTs working in the hospital, right, which demand frequent real-time spatial and navigation processing, might be associated with reduced burden of Alzheimer's disease mortality compared to other occupations. So that was their hypothesis. There was an idea. Now, their idea came from previous research, right? That's why the introduction here. Look, there's been this study that taxi drivers have changed hippocampuses, and we know that Alzheimer's is involved in the hippocampus, right? So all those pieces of evidence suggest this hypothesis. Now, the first way to maybe develop that hypothesis is to look for data to see whether taxi drivers actually have less Alzheimer's, because that had not actually been explored before. That's what's new. That's why they're publishing this paper, right? That's the new thing that they have found. All right, we'll speed it up now. Let's look at some figures and some of the parts of what they did. We're not going to go through all the methods. So you can get a lot from this one page. That's why we spent so much time on it. Right? This one page here, this first page of this publication gives you a whole bunch of like, this is what this was about. This is why we did it. This is how we did it. But there's caveats in here in the discussion, which are worth looking at. All right. So they collect all this stuff. They basically download this giant file. They go through, they sort it out. They sum it up right here in table number 1. And they're actually split it out between, like, here's ambulance drivers, here's taxi drivers, right? And then they have aircraft pilots, all right, bus drivers and ship captains, all right, those are other transportation type things. And then you have all other occupations, 8.8 million. And if you wanted to know, like, ambulance drivers, most of them have 52% have a high school degree. Some have 23% have a college degree. Whereas if you look at, let's say, I remember seeing this, bus drivers, 60%, fewer college educated, and so forth. And you're looking at all these types of data because you're also going to look to see if there's other correlations. Is there a stronger correlation with, the amount of education or, race and ethnicity background or female, male, and so forth. So they have all this data, and they're actually going to analyze all this too. And none of it turns out to be terribly significant. There's not like any correlations here that are very strong. The strength really comes with just these two disciplines and the mortality rates. All right, so then we get down to, here it is, deaths attributed to Alzheimer's by occupation. Ambulance drivers, 0.91. Okay, so you have taxi drivers, ambulances, bus drivers, 1.65. Right, so even bus drivers have a lower number than the average. Remember, the average was 3.88. But okay, tables, fine, but graphs better. Right, graphs and figures, that's what we need. So we have Alzheimer's deaths, taxi drivers, ambulance drivers. Here we have these two different colored blobs, all other occupations. So every other gray dot represents another occupation. And across the bottom here, we have average time of death. All right, so the average among ambulance drivers is close to 65, whereas the average lifespan, all right, for taxi drivers, longer, all right, at like 68 or 69. That's interesting thing too, is there's quite a spread, right? The average lifespan, and some of these occupations have hundreds of thousands of individuals in them. So if there's hundreds of thousands of individuals with this occupation versus this one over here, that's a 25-year difference in average lifespan. So, I'm sure there's lots of other papers that are written about that type of stuff, but we're only interested in Alzheimer's and taxi drivers and ambulances here. So we're just showing that. And so the idea is that this is the percent death down here, and they have these very low numbers down here, and risk adjusted they're only looking for the ages 55 and above, right? So they've taken out the lower numbers. Because Alzheimer's is not a factor earlier in life, and you can't tell whether they're going to die or not from Alzheimer's at that point. But this graphic kind of shows it sort of combined, like by occupation. There's an occupation that has the highest number. I can't remember what they said that. They even think it's said in here. I think they didn't want to reveal what the highest one was. There's several occupations that have much, much higher mortality odds ratio. And then down here we have, our taxi drivers and our ambulance drivers. They note that this was a retrospective observational study. They simply have the data. They were not able to do talk to the patients because they're all dead. Patients were not involved in setting the research question or the outcome measures, obviously, because they're not alive, or advising interpretation of writing up the results. The study was unfunded, therefore no funding was available for patient and public involvement. Right? They don't have a big grant to do this. This is somebody's project. Hey, let's, on our spare time during lunch, let's crunch some numbers with the supercomputer. Okay, I'm going to get to the sensitivity analysis. We performed 4 sensitivity analysis to assess the robustness of our comparisons. Firstly, we repeated analysis among people who died after age 60 to capture the age range, most typical Alzheimer's disease onset, that's where the onset is. Secondly, we broadened the definition of Alzheimer's disease mortality to include Alzheimer's disease as an underlying or contributing causing of death on the death certificate. Right? That would be a situation where somebody has Alzheimer's, and maybe it hasn't progressed to the point where that's the thing that they directly died from. They could have been in a car accident, right? They could have gotten cancer. They could, it could be other things that were like the direct cause of like their immediate death. but they had Alzheimer's. So eventually they would have died from Alzheimer's, right? So that's why they're including those in there. Thirdly, we assessed Alzheimer's disease mortality among bus drivers, aircraft pilots, and ship captains. Right? These are transportation-based occupations with fewer real-time navigation demands due to frequent predetermined routes that may not lead to similar hippocampus changes. In fact, there's been a study comparing bus drivers to, I can show you. Here's way back in 2006, London taxi drivers and bus drivers, a structural MRI and a neurophysiological analysis. And in this case, they've actually done MRIs of the brains of bus drivers and taxi drivers to compare the two. And yes, they have different structures, all right? Their hippocampi actually have noticeable differences between the two, suggesting that there are the amount of spatial awareness and stuff that they have to deal with on those two jobs is different enough that it develops differences in their brain over time, having performed that occupation for so long. And then they actually did a bunch of different, neuropsychological analyses as well. That's a bunch of questions and throwing like things they have to look at, and they measure the amount of time they react and all that. All right. And they find that, yes, there are differences between them. So that's kind of cool. That bus drivers are different than taxi drivers. Fourthly, we elevated deaths with underlying causes from other forms of dementia where the associated pathophysiology is not focused on the hippocampus, like vascular dementia and unspecified dementia. So there's other dementia that would be noted on the death certificate or their medical records. And so they could see that, like, hey, here's a bunch of taxi drivers that have this form of dementia, and then here's other groups, other occupations, and they have these forms of dementia. Is there a difference in the amount of in the percentage of Alzheimer's deaths? Right. And again, to give away the story there, yeah, there's no difference there. Right. There's no significant difference between that. So taxi drivers can get other forms of dementia, and just like any other occupation does, it's only this hippocampus difference, right, that seems to be related to the Alzheimer's differences, or I'll say their Alzheimer's difference is the thing that's differentiates themselves. And maybe it's because of the hippocampus. All right. So what they were interested in is what are other kinds of dementia that aren't caused by a hippocampus? And do they also show this relationship? And they do not. Here we go. Here are bus drivers, aircraft pilots, ship captains, right? Those are these three dots in here. Here's our dots down here, actually, for taxi drivers and ambulance drivers. Sorry, I forget my two categories. And you can see these other occupations have much higher risk adjusted Alzheimer's deaths. All right. In fact, being a, aircraft pilot, way up here, apparently a really stressful job. Well, I think taxi driver would be stressful as well, but apparently not, maybe not stressing the hippocampus. And if the hippocampus is actually important in development of Alzheimer's, maybe that's the difference. But why they're higher, that would be another interesting question. I mean, see, anytime you do this type of data analysis, you end up creating 10 more questions. You may you help answer one question potentially, or at least start the route to answering that question, but you create a lot of other interesting questions for further analyses. So conclusion. Oh, sorry. We were supposed to be reading the discussion, the principal findings. The original study motivated the study was based on hippocampal changes in London taxi drivers. Although cognitive demands in London taxi drivers are unique due to the knowledge required extensive training and an exam of navigating the city. Apparently there's quite a training regimen to become a London taxi driver. The core aspects of spatial navigation and frequent complex navigational tasks are also central to the role of U.S. taxi drivers, or at least historically. Consistent with our findings, a follow-up London bus drivers did not show the same hippocampal changes as in hippocampal changes as in taxi drivers, possibly due to the predetermined nature of bus drivers' routes, or at least that's they're thinking. Like bus drivers are not don't have the same kind of level of needing to be constantly thinking about new places and where they're going. If a hypothetical link between hippocampal changes in taxi drivers and future risk of death from Alzheimer's disease exists, like if this is a real thing, right? If there's a connection between the hippocampus and the risk of death from Alzheimer's, our findings among U.S. taxi and bus drivers are consistent with studies of hippocampal changes among their London counterparts. So it's like we have more data. Now they weren't, that previous study really wasn't studying Alzheimer's. They're saying like, we're seeing the same effects also with the hippocampus. And I'll bet that if you went to, I'll bet somebody is probably looking at British, medical records now and looking at Alzheimer's and asking the question, do we see the same thing with taxi drivers there? All right. And once you do that, and maybe there's other places in the world where you could get a similar data set, if they've collected that kind of data, again, apples to apples, super important here, really important medical records that we use consistent terminology and recording methods. But if you start collecting that data from multiple different places around the world and you start seeing these same occupations ending up with lower Alzheimer's rates, then that really then drives you to like, let's study them more. It's like, let's do some more to figure out how it is that they're somehow being prevented from developing Alzheimer's. But there are other possible explanations for what's going on here. Strengths and limitations of this study. Right? You should be willing to say like, hey, this was a strength of our study, but also, we were unable to do this. And you should know about that if you're reading this paper. Importantly, our study design has several limitations that limit causal inference. In other words, is this a cause and effect thing? And that results in the possibility of other explanations, including unmeasured confounding from biological, social, and administrative factors. First, and perhaps most importantly, selection bias is possible because individuals who are at higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease may be less likely to enter or remain in memory-intensive driving occupations such as taxi or ambulance driving. See? Did you think of that? What if you're developing Alzheimer's and you're like, oh man, very early stages and I can't remember where I'm going, or I'm having more trouble like maintaining this map in my head, then maybe you leave that profession early. And if you do and you get another job, then maybe you're not recording that as like that's your profession. Right? This could mean that lower Alzheimer's disease mortality observed in these occupations is not due to the protective effect of the job itself. It's not like because I was this. It might be because those prone to disease have self-selected out of such roles. But there's a big however here, and I think this is completely justified. Alzheimer's disease symptoms typically develop after patients' working years, with only 5 to 10% of cases occurring in people younger than 65. In other words, you wouldn't know it. It's not really diagnosable, right? Much before 65 for most people. There's a certain form of Alzheimer's called early onset, but that's a much more rare form. It wouldn't appear that taxi drivers are just leaving because they are developing Alzheimer's. Now, maybe there's something that prevents them from ever getting into it. Like there is something different about their brains such that they don't go into, if you're going to develop Alzheimer's in 30 years, you don't end up being a taxi driver to begin with, right? That goes back to the genetic thing. Maybe if you're predisposed to being really good with spatial awareness, and so that makes it easy for you to take up that kind of profession, then you are self-selecting individuals to that profession, which might have protection against Alzheimer's. But that is still an important finding. That actually supports this here. It might say that it says this isn't a random, like, it's not like everyone randomly becomes a taxi driver or not. There could be some reasons why individuals are more likely to become taxi drivers because of their genetic background. And that genetic background just happens to also protect them against Alzheimer's. All right, but these things are really hard to test, right? In terms of getting down to the cause, like actually seeing like the direct cause. And we don't even really know exactly what it is about the hippocampus that would, like what are the triggers that make the hippocampus begin to shrivel and shrink. We just have these correlations. right? And correlations are still important, and they can, but you got to really be careful not to say like, oh, if I just see that, I know that's causing that. But as long as you've thought about all these factors, you can have greater confidence in your inference from your correlation. While subtle symptoms could develop earlier, they would still most likely be after a person has worked long enough to deem the occupation to be so-called usual occupation. Like even if you worked till you're 50, and then you're like, hey, I just don't really feel like I can do this job anymore. Maybe it was because you're developing Alzheimer's. You would still call it your occupation, even if you quit 10 years early. So this suggests substantial attrition from navigational jobs due to development of Alzheimer's disease. But that's not what has happened. Moreover, even if lifelong taxi driving selects for individuals with strong spatial processing, our findings would still suggest an interesting link between spatial processing skills and the risk of Alzheimer's. Oh, that's what I was saying just a few minutes ago. Yeah, I said I wasn't going to read all this. So let's just trying to hit the highlights here. Third, death certificates likely underestimate the numbers of death caused by Alzheimer's disease, and the degree of underestimation may vary by occupation. Right? So maybe in different occupations, like maybe occupations that maybe don't have as high a salary, maybe you can't afford health insurance, so maybe you don't go to the doctor as much. Maybe then you have a greater chance of not ever getting diagnosed. And maybe you don't seek out treatment. There might be some occupations that are then related to different socioeconomic status or different social situations, right? And they do work on doing statistics to try to figure that stuff out and account for those variables. There's a bunch more there, but fourthly, analysis of mortality records are likely to understate Alzheimer's disease prevalence as it contributes to mortality. It is complex, and more proximal causes may have reported on death certificates. However, any diagnostic error in the study is unlikely to differ across occupation groups. If you got in a car accident, and you didn't report the fact you had Alzheimer's, or you didn't know about it and it didn't get on the death certificate, right? Then you might missed out on that. But, are there going to be that many more taxi drivers that have that kind of clerical error, compared to other, the other 400 occupations? It seems like some of these errors are the types of things that can occur in any occupation, unless you have a strong reason to believe there would be a bias for a particular occupation. And you've tested for that, that's probably not the problem. Okay, we're almost done. Our large-scale epidemiological findings raise novel questions about the linkage between taxi and ambulance driving and Alzheimer's disease mortality. Yes, I agree, it does. While these findings suggest a potential link between the demands of these occupations and reduced Alzheimer's risk, the study design does not permit interpretation of a causal effect between occupations and a risk of Alzheimer's disease, mortality, or neurological changes in the hippocampus, because they didn't study the hippocampi of all these taxi drivers. The assumption is that they're probably similar to the ones in London where the actual hippocampi were looked at. It's not a bad inference. It seems reasonable, but you can't directly interpret this as a causal effect. They're correct to say that. This is what won't show up in any popular press article. They'll make it sound like, taxi drivers have been proven that driving a taxi, reduces your chance of getting Alzheimer's. That is the evidence of this paper is supportive of that idea, but this paper does not prove that. Okay, in the stronger sense that many people will react to or think is being said. And again, here's another very important sentence. We view these findings not as conclusive, but as hypotheses generating. Like, we've just created a bunch of ideas from this paper. From this data analysis, we have created new ideas, new things we can look at that will help us get closer to a causal relationship, connecting more directly hippocampus, occupation, and disease. Further research is necessary to definitively conclude whether the spatial cognitive work required by these occupations, see, we're making a big assumption that it's the spatial orientation ability of taxi drivers and ambulance drivers that affects their hippocampus, and the hippocampus then affects whether they get Alzheimer's. right? So there's two connections here. And it's going to take a lot of work to show that it's the actual fact that they're in a spatially complex environment that is the cause of the hippocampus changes. I think this evidence is very strong, strongly supports that idea, but more work would need to be done to be even more confident of death from Alzheimer's disease and whether any cognitive activities can potentially be preventative. I mean, isn't that what you're here for? Isn't that what you want to know? If I just ride my bike every single day and I'm in a spatially complex environment because I don't want to get hit by a car and I'm looking for, things that I'm running over, and it's like, and I'm just like, my world is very three-dimensional. Am I giving my hippocampus a really big workout? And if I'm giving it a big workout, am I shaping my hippocampus over many years? And is that going to give me some preventative medicine for Alzheimer's? That's what you want to come out of a work like this. But unfortunately, we can't say that for sure. It says it's possible. It says that possibility exists. That is a real possibility based on what's presented here, that complex spatial environments, I don't know, does playing video games count? It's like maybe a generation of 20s, 30s, and almost into the 40s who have been brought up on video games. Maybe that's going to create maybe Alzheimer's will level off and start to drop. Maybe we've been doused in a complex three-dimensional spatial environment. I'm not sure that sitting in front of a screen, but in the new world of like 3D, maybe your medicine for the day is you better play 2 hours of video games, right? Put on your Oculus glasses and say to yourself, I'm preventing Alzheimer's. No, but that'll be a future study, right? You're going to be surveyed. All you kids out there, you're going to be surveyed. Remember right now, like, figure out how many hours did you spend playing video games? And somebody's going to look at 10 million people and analyze how much time they spent playing the certain types of video games, and then compare them to ones that didn't play video games, right? Their parents said, go out in nature, and just like, we don't want you on the computer all day. And it's like, oh man, Mom, you made me get Alzheimer's because of that. I'm sorry, I should not be joking about that. No joke at all. But you get the point, right? We don't really know the environmental factors that are leading to increased risk or decreased risk. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about curing. We're not talking about ultimate, 100% prevention. We're talking about changing the trajectory of the risk. And that's just what we don't know. We don't know what is like the things to do that would lower risk. And what are the things people are doing right now that are increasing risk, that we might be able to, reduce the amount of that action, in our lives or in the population. All right. I think that's enough. Yeah, definitely been enough. I'm right at 60 minutes. Yeah. Alzheimer's disease mortality among taxi and ambulance drivers. On the surface of it, that probably sounded like a really curious observation. But as I showed you, there was some background initial findings of other people that just, they were interested in the hippocampus, not because of Alzheimer's, because they're interested in the hippocampus and different things with spatial research, spatial orientation. And because of what they found with taxi drivers compared to bus drivers, that led somebody to think about this, like, well, what about Alzheimer's connection? This is the way science progresses, right? This is the incremental analysis. And this is the reason why larger and larger data sets, and the more data we have, the more discoveries like this we can find. All right. Hey, thanks for hanging out. Appreciate your time. Best wishes to all of you. Blessings. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.